Hi, welcome to Culture and Causation. I'm Aaron Briley, and I have my colleague with me today, Robert Begley, and we'll be discussing his article on Duke Ellington titled, "No Man Swings More or Stands Higher Than the Duke." And I'll put the link in the show notes below. So let me introduce you to my guest. Hi, Robert. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Aaron. Nice to be here again with you, this time talking about one of my musical heroes, Duke Ellington.
I am very excited about this. And I'm excited because I think for most young people, and perhaps for those who are not so young, Duke Ellington isn't as well known as he should be. And on a personal note, I actually know of Duke Ellington because I took a class, a jazz appreciation class, during my first year in college. But outside of that, I really hadn't heard of him, and I don't know much about him. So I'm also excited to discuss the Duke today. And considering his birthday is on April 29th, I'd like to discuss with you a few reasons why he should not only be remembered, but also celebrated. So let me give a thumbnail portrait of his life. He was born Edward Kennedy Ellington in Washington, D.C. in 1899. He died in New York in 1974. He was the son of a butler and the grandson of a slave. He was given the nickname Duke as a child because of his aristocratic demeanor and sense of fashion. He was a pioneering jazz composer and musician. In 1927, he gets a gig working at the Cotton Club in Harlem, which really gives him enormous exposure and ends up making him a household name. Some of his musical hits include Mood Indigo, It Don't Mean a Thing, If It Ain't Got That Swing, and Solitude. In 1999, he was posthumously awarded a special Pulitzer Prize. And on their site, this is what it says, quote, "Bestowed posthumously, commemorating the centennial year of his birth, in recognition of his musical genius, which evoked aesthetically the principles of democracy through the medium of jazz, and thus made an indelible contribution to art and culture," unquote. So I think that's a very fitting tribute to a very great man. Now, in your article, Robert, you mentioned his role in American culture. So I'd like to read an excerpt and get your response. You write, quote, "Duke held that music such as his offered much needed spiritual fuel, and that it had a vital role to play during the Cold War era of the 1950s. He said," now you're quoting Ellington, quote, "When people behind the Iron Curtain tune in to Radio Free Europe for a jazz program, they're getting two things at once: the music they want to hear and a little exercise in individual freedom," unquote. And you also write later on, quote, "During the 1960s, the civil rights movement heated up, and the music of the times reflected the tumult. Ellington composed a new collection of short songs about Black history, this time focusing more specifically on the aspirations of Blacks," unquote. So I know that's sort of a mouthful there, but I just want to emphasize that he had an impact during the Cold War and also during the Revolutionary 60s. And I wanted to know if you could explain what these roles were, or what this impact was, or how his music related to those two very different times.
Sure, Aaron. First of all, he had an impact from the 20s through the 30s, through the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it was a broad spectrum and of the timeline but by the 50s and 60s, he was already the preeminent jazz composer, innovator. If we think about jazz, so let's talk about role in American history. What art form, particularly music form, do we say is American? That's jazz. Okay. And who is the number one innovator in jazz? He didn't invent jazz, but he perfected it. And that's what Duke Ellington stands for. So by this time in the 50s and 60s, he had this role that was this honor and prestige that nobody could touch him. But as a lifelong American who knew the good and the bad about America, that there was opportunity, despite racism, which we'll talk about later on, he had gone to Europe a few times, and his point here was that people should be free. They should be free to enjoy the kind of art form that they want. And the reference to the Iron Curtain, that's what people wanted in the 50s in the Iron Curtain. They were pretty much brainwashed to listen to whatever art, specific, what was approved by the Soviets. And Ellington is like, nope, we'll smuggle in some bootleg jazz because here's an exercise in individual freedom. So he knew that it was important for people to have appreciation of jazz, but also to have freedom to choose whichever art form, particularly whatever music form they would want to hear.
And also, just to interject, if I can, Robert, mm-hmm. Is it true? I think it is true, although I'm not an expert here, that jazz itself has a lot more freedom in it than some of the more classical styles where you can improvise. Isn't that one of the key components of jazz music?
That's a key component. And actually later on, when we talk about individualism, that's exactly where I was going to bring that up, because there are individual musicians, and Ellington picked out the best musicians. He didn't want the ones who could read sheet music and were technically superb. He wanted that freedom of style. He would tell, for instance, he'd be in a rehearsal and he'd tell one of the brass players, I want to hear a sound that's like a little cub who's hungry and misses his mama lion, like that. He's looking for his next meal. That's the sound I want to hear, and no classical composer would say that, like this is Duke's style, and that's what he wants to pull out of. And then they go wah wah, and it's like this. Right. So the individualism is a big part of that as well, and that freestyle that is less structured, but with a lot of technical chops, as we say.
And also, you mentioned Ellington's music in relation to the civil rights movement, and I wonder if you could say a few words about that.
Yeah. So again, the civil rights movement, he was an inspiration certainly to Martin Luther King, and because he had been around so long and had gone to Europe and had. When he was a kid, he told his mom, someday your son is going to be bound before royalty. And that had happened. He played a piece for the Queen that he wrote that no one had heard except for her. And the point here is that he had definite respect for law and order and the rights of the individual, and particularly the blacks, because he had witnessed it, he had experienced it, and he had witnessed it, and he knew that there was a mistake here. It was wrong. So then he wrote about it, but he wrote about it from the aspect of this is something we should strive for. This is something aspirational. The best thing we can do, again, if we go back to the Reverend Ike, the best thing you can do for the poor is not be one of them. And so his point was, raise yourself up. There is opportunity here. In fact, opportunity is the norm. And these other things are, unfortunately, they're aberrations, which, in the right situation, you have that ability to rise up. And as you said in his bio, his grandfather was a slave. Mm-hmm. And so just he witnessed the experience over the length of his life that things gradually got better. And he was one of the reasons why.
Great. So it's this idea, though, that his music, on the one hand, reflected what was going on during the 60s. He was able to give that expression, but he did it in a way where people could look up to it, where he could uplift people instead of telling people how much they were oppressed and how much they should maybe, I don't know, feel like they're a victim. He didn't have that point of view. Yeah. He was much more self-reliant and much more individualistic, as you said. Now, I want to discuss Ellington, the man, as distinct from his music for a moment, if that's possible, because he stands out as being self-reliant and a goal achiever. And I'm always on the lookout for people with these qualities because I find them inspiring and instructional. Now, in your article, Robert, you write, quote, this collection was titled My People, which was written by Ellington. And Ellington's biographer Terry Teachout describes Duke's views on race relations. This is from your article. Quote, like Booker T. Washington before him, Ellington had always believed that the way for blacks to overcome the crippling burden of racism was for them to assume individual responsibility for their collective plight and forge a well-heeled, well-educated middle class of their own, unquote. So can you speak to his individualism and why you think this was an important factor in his life?
Yeah, so the individualism for Duke started as from his childhood. He was actually, baseball was his first love. He was born in Washington, D.C., and definitely experienced some racism, but music is what captured him. And when he started playing piano and putting a band together, he would look for gigs. So as an entrepreneur, he looked for gigs, but he also was an artist, a painter. So he would paint signs for the venues where he would play. So he charged a commission there, and then he charged a commission for, for getting the gig. Mm-hmm. And so entrepreneurial spirit is a big part of that individual because they're intertwined, mm-hmm. that it shows effort and responsibility. And this is what he had later on in life as an employer. Okay, he paid for all of the musicians. They were like under his umbrella. Mm-hmm. And so the point here is that he knew that effort was required in order for him to succeed. And again, just going back to the fact that he did it, he had some obstacles to overcome. And his bandmates, he used that example to the bandmates. And sometimes, like, for instance, if they felt like they were underpaid, Duke would tell them that I can't pay you as much as you want, as much as you're worth. Nobody can. Yeah. And if you hear that from your employer, do you feel good? Do you feel bad? And so his point, so he was an entrepreneur, he was an employer, and he really didn't like business. He just wanted to compose and go out on tour and not really take care of the money side. He just wanted like the artistic side. And that's where, again, similarly, his individualism was that he wasn't tied down to a place. By the way, my father is the biggest Duke Ellington fan I ever met. I mean, growing up in my household, we heard Duke's music, whether we liked it or not. We heard it, and fortunately, we liked it. But he would quote Duke by saying, "New York isn't my home. That's just where I pick up my mail." So like the whole world was his domain because he was always out, composing, touring, and getting the most out of life. And
what about, actually, just to say one other thing, Robert, I think this might tie in. Didn't he, as far as his innovating and his entrepreneurialism, wasn't he one of the first people to create this big band type of ensemble?
Big band jazz.
Something he's known for, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
and
exactly. At the Cotton Club, as you mentioned, at the Cotton Club in 1927, the Roaring Twenties, mm-hmm. was when the Cotton Club and Harlem became like the real place to be, the in place to be. And Duke was at the forefront. He got radio gigs. They would record his music and play it for people all over America. So we're talking a couple of decades later, people in Europe were able to hear it. But that was one of the ways that he became well known, was from the big band style that, again, he didn't invent it, but he absolutely perfected it. Aaron, if we continue along the history mm-hmm. line, so from the 20s, the Roaring Twenties, Ellington was right there. Then after the Depression, he couldn't, he was still making money because people still needed entertainment. That's kind of one of the things people still need if they don't have money. So here's the spiritual fuel that Ellington had provided for people who were down and out. He wrote songs in a sentimental mood, mm-hmm. Mood indigo, just the titles of his songs put you in a certain mood. And solitude, like to make you feel like it's you against the world. And that's that individualist aspect again, if we want to go back to that.
That's really good. I think that's a great point to bring up, where his music actually appealed to people during the Roaring Twenties when they're at their highest, and it
Yep.
also appealed to people at their lowest. And so he had this universal appeal through thick and thin. He was there. He was right there with you.
Yep.
I also want to talk about something that made him unique, and that was his dapper style and his sort of sense of fashion. Can you speak about that? Was he was always
Sure.
together well and well groomed?
That his name, he Edward Kennedy, and I don't like Ted Kennedy. I never call him that name, but Duke, he earned that name because he was well dressed, and also he knew history. He knew the Duke of Wellington was a famous. He played on that as well. So just a well thought man who had motives, who had egoistic motives. Okay, let's tie this individualism part also to the egoistic aspect, where he thought to himself, if I work harder than anybody and I create value, guess what? I'm entitled to the rewards of that value, which is most rewarded in America. Okay, especially back then in that era. So we have the egoistic aspect, and to look good automatically showed a dignity and a respect. So, for instance, when he went to Europe, okay, in the 1940s, he was invited to Europe, and he always, not only was he impeccably dressed, but he made sure all the musicians were as well. And now all of a sudden Europe, they're seeing these, and the American South also saw this, they get off the train and it's all these well-dressed black men who were holding themselves to this incredibly high standard, led by one man, Duke Ellington. So he knew the importance of fashion in that sense. He knew the integration of fashion with respect and with dignity and with quality. And he mastered that just as well as he mastered, the musical sphere. He mastered the fashion sphere.
And I also want to bring up racism, because this was during a time, we're talking the Jim Crow South, before this, civil rights movement. And I think what we said a few weeks ago about Jackie Robinson can apply here to Duke Ellington. And that's, he really led by example. People saw him and saw how he spoke, saw his attitude, saw how he dressed, saw the sort of, like you just said, the self-respect that he had and the dignity that he portrayed in his music and in his words and in his dress. And this, I think was not an insignificant factor in getting the majority of people who hadn't really seen blacks in this light to see them in a different light. I mean, can you say a few words about that? Do you think this parallels with Jackie Robinson and how Jackie Robinson's kind of character and attitude and behavior on the field, how that sort of helped to bring a better light to blacks at that time? Do you think that was similar to what Duke Ellington did, although Duke was first? He sort of did this before.
Yeah, he did it before, but he did it before Jackie Robinson. The two achievements they're similar and they're different in a major sense, because Robinson broke through something that did not exist, and he went into an all-white profession. With Ellington, it wasn't that way. There was a respect for Louis Armstrong and others before him, and there was an integration. There was a good level of integration with Benny Goodman and other jazz greats. So in that sense, he didn't face the absolute single-handed type of racism. But when he was a kid in D.C., there were some race riots, and he feared for his life more than once. And that was one of the reasons he moved to New York, particularly from New York to Harlem. And guess where he lived in Harlem? Actually, I lived there for a couple of years, right near his home. It's called Sugar Hill. It's a part of Harlem. And he called it the sweetest part of Harlem. It's on a huge hill. And there's one street that's called Strivers Row. And it's for that same, if we go back to that aspirational aspect. So they called it the Harlem Renaissance. When Duke Ellington was there, Paul Robeson and other famous blacks and from all different kinds of industries who were who were aiming at this aspirational aspect. And so as far as the South went, same as in Europe, his group of musicians would come out of the Pullman trains, like first class. And all of the, kind of rednecks their jaws would drop seeing this line of well-dressed, well-behaved people passing by. And, there were places they were certainly turned away from. And I can't sugarcoat this point, and especially not all of his musicians were able to take care of themselves. Some of them were alcoholics, and they had drug addictions, and even that as an employer, Duke would say, "Look, I'm going to treat you as an adult. It's kind of your responsibility to show up on time, to perform, to do this and that." So here, even though it's in the artistic realm of performance, performing music, there's a business side, meaning you have to be here on time, you have to be accountable, you have to. And why did he emphasize these things? For self-respect. Okay. And he wanted to bring out he wanted to show by example, self-respect, and then also pull that out first of the musicians, but even of the racists down in the South, because they have to think differently now. Their whole world is upside down when they see these elegantly dressed and competent musicians walking past them, and they just have one view of reality, that all blacks are evil, and then they see this thing. So it's another example where Ellington had this impact that is really hard to measure, but he broke through. And at the end, you listed some of his achievements, but Presidential Medal of Honor too, that he got. Nixon, as soon as Nixon became president in 1969, he had, and you could see this the end of my article in the Objective Standard, Nixon actually plays Happy Birthday. He has Duke, sitting at the piano, and Duke is doing his own concert, and then Nixon gets everyone to sing Happy Birthday. So it's a nice full circle of the American experience here, where somebody who's born, as we said, grandson of a slave, son of a butler, but lifts himself up, signifies dignity and elegance, and his music showed it, over the course of, 6-7 decades, 1,700 compositions, the man's achievement. If we just look at like American composers, not too many of the Beatles did not write 1,700, and there are 4 of them, So that's just to show you the scale that we're talking about here.
Well, I think that's a great point to bring up, and a fitting place to end. Thank you so much, Robert, for coming on to discuss one of the giants of jazz and explaining why no man swings more or stands higher than the Duke. And, I always ask my guests for the last word. So do you have anything else that you'd like to add, or do you
listen to Take the A Train? One of my favorite, it's in New York City. The A Train would take you from Midtown up to Sugar Hill. There's a video at the bottom of the article that I wrote, it just shows the benevolence of Duke, his music, and the musicians, and that's a way to celebrate a great man's life and achievement.
Great. And where can people find you or your work online, Robert?
So I'm with the Objective Standard. You can see my bio there, but also myself, robert-begley.com.
Well, thank you so much, Robert, and hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yes. Thank you, Aaron. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.